Today we talk about the story of this lens, the Helios 44. It's a really interesting piece of history. It involves so much. I was aware a little bit of this, but I was shocked about the full extent of the story. So you might know a little bit, but you don't know everything. And today we talk about that, about the guy who invented this, about the world wars, about all of the things that needed to happen for this lens to now exist. And then we're closing some circles even, because we're taking this lens to Ukraine for documentary, and it's even involved before that in Ukraine and so on. So interesting story. Let's sit down and talk about some history. Chapter 1. The Inventor. So, to start off the story, we go back to 1889, when the guy who would develop our lens was actually born, Willy-Walter Mertet. And listen, I could not find a picture of him, but trust me, we can still paint some color into his life. So, Willy-Walter Mertet, a French guy born in Germany, of a French father and a German mother in Dresden, and he went through some things. He has a little bit of a Forrest Gump vibe in the Germany of the early 20th century. So he studied math in Jena until 1910, when he did his PhD under such an interesting teacher, for example, as Wilhelm Conrad Röntgen, who we should know from the Röntgen radiation. And then he went to work at Zeiss, and just look at the building from Zeiss of this time. It's an amazing complex. It was a company that was rapidly expanding before the First World War. They had first one factory, second factory, third factory, and then they had this complex that was ever expanding, and there was a lot of things taking place there. We are in a time where the development of optical engineering was not just pushing the boundaries of photography, but the boundaries of how far we humans could perceive the universe. And our guy, Willy-Walter Mertet, and I really like saying that name, Willy-Walter Mertet, he came to be quite good at Zeiss. He distinguished himself, and he quickly came to lead the newly developed Fotorechenabteilung, which means the photographical calculation division. Chapter 2. War. But he was interrupted in his work at Zeiss because he was called to fight in the First World War. And I can't find details about this also, but just think about the drama with a French father, a German mother. The feelings he must have had must have been quite interesting about this whole war. And then quickly he got wounded heavily and returned in 1915. And at that time, after that, he did something remarkable. So let's talk about lens design for a second. It's not get too technical, but the most important thing at this point was to bring down the f-stop. The f-stop is the ratio between the opening of the aperture, which is how much light it lets through basically, in ratio with the focal length. So the focal length is the angle at which a lens bends the light, and the ratio between those two determines how much light gets onto the film. And that's a very important number, because the lower the f-stop, the more light you get. And we're at a time where film was not as developed as today, so it was not possible to just buy a 400 ISO film. So like the film was not as sensitive yet as it was today. That was a whole different thing that was getting better at the same time, but we're looking at the lens side of this. And for this, we got one of the last important developments, for example, was the Zeiss planar design from 1896, which was able to push down the f-stop to f4.5, which is pretty good. It's decent. You can already work with that with modern film, but it's still a little bit slow. But then we come to our guy, Willy-Walter Mertet again. So when Mertet returned to Zeiss after being wounded, he returned to a different company because, well, optical engineering was not just pushing the boundaries of science, but during the First World War, Zeiss became one of the most important manufacturers for optical military designs. And just a second of interruption, but as I'm editing this video, I realized that the binoculars I just showed you, designed by Zeiss for officers in the First World War, I actually had the chance to try them out myself, and I was shocked. by how good they are. So if you want really good binoculars, just get historic size ones. Everything after the Second World War started should be pretty good. At this time, with aerial photography becoming a thing and binoculars and all of that, well, their development was not just making us better at understanding the universe, but also at killing each other. So he would also later probably do some military designs. But well, after the First World War, lots of lenses were coming out that were amazing and iconic, and I would love to use all of them. But one of the most important ones came from him. He developed the Zeiss Biotard 58mm F.2.0. That's a lot more light, and he was not the first guy to develop a lens with this aperture, but this was the most marketable and the most famous from this time, and it is a quite iconic design. The 58mm focal length is just above 50, which is kind of the standard for 35mm photography, but it's just slightly more, and that makes it have a very interesting angle. I find it's a very interesting lens and beautiful. People still use this Zeiss lens today, but it's not yet the lens that we are talking about. For this, some more things need to happen. So when Merthe achieved this lens design, we are in the year 1936 in Germany. So we are well inside the regime of the National Socialists. And I cannot tell you what he thought about this, but what I know is that, again, he would be working for military designs. He developed the very sensitive Biotard, same series of lenses, 140mm 1.4, and oh my god, I would love to try that one out and see for myself what this lens can do. But he developed this for the Nazi regime, so don't know what he thought about this, but this was not the first time that kind of his art form of developing lenses was used for military purposes, and it would not be the last time that developments about war would change the course of his life. If you watched until this far in the video, many of you are not subscribed, and you have now the chance to change that. Subscribe to the channel, it helps a lot. Yeah, would be great. I appreciate it. I take a lot of work for these videos, so just hit the button, man. And also, we will take the lens, the subject of this video, to Ukraine very soon to shoot a documentary there about the war. And if you can support us anyhow, we're doing a fundraiser right now. It would be great to have your support if you can. It helps us so much. We need the money to do independent journalism there, and yeah, it's a good cause to support, and you will see what we will be up to there on this channel also when we are there. So keep an eye open for that, and support us if you can. It helps a lot. Thank you. So the Second World War happened. Germany devastated Europe, and they killed, I think, 27 people from the Soviet Union. And now we get to when the decision was made that would determine the course of history that would lead to our lens design. We are talking about the Yalta Conference on actually the Crimean Peninsula, which is where our story will also be returning way later in this video, in the story of this lens. But for now, Stalin met with Churchill, and it was clear at this point that Germany would lose the war, so they were starting to think about the future, and they agreed on some things, on reparations for the war. Russia suffered tremendously, so they agreed on 20 billion euros that Germany would have to pay, and 10 of those would go to Russia. They also agreed to technology transfer, and also the humans creating that technology. And you probably have heard of Operation Paperclip. So for those who don't know, this was the operation where the US took 1,600 scientists and brought them to America, and among them Werner von Braun, so it was quite an influential operation, and it wasn't deportation, it was not as brutal as what we're going to see very soon here. There is the Russian equivalent of that, which is larger in scope, but hadn't been so effective because it was a more brutal operation. But before we talk about the Russian operation, we will also end the story of our guy, Walter MFT, because he would not go to Russia. He would be having to go to America, and there he died. He was there and started his work and quickly died of an illness, and that's the end of him. What a life. I found this story very interesting, so I just had to share it. So let's go back to what the Soviets, the Russians, were up to at this point. And well, by the order of Stalin, they initiated the
Операция Осо-Авиахим.
No way I can pronounce this name correctly, so I asked a Ukrainian friend of mine to do it for me.
Операция Осо-Авиахим.
It was a massive operation. They had almost 100 trains ready for this, and then soldiers throughout the whole occupation zone sprung into action and deported almost 2,000 different scientists. Sudden attacks were not only made in Bleicherode, but all over the entire Soviet occupation zone, in Halle, Leipzig and Dresden, in Dessau, Jena and Rostock, in Brandenburg, Potsdam and East Berlin. According to credible estimates, around 20,000 Germans, fitters, foremen, technicians, engineers, designers and scientists, women and children, were picked up, loaded and transported in that one night. This is a quote by Kurt Magnus, a gyro specialist that had been also transported away. Among the 2,000 scientists who were deported, there were also 14 people working in the photographic and cinema industry, and also one from Zeiss, but he was just told that he would go to Russia and he died of a heart attack, so it's quite a bleak story. But with the humans, they also took a lot of the plans and the technology they took for years from the companies, and also from Zeiss. The building, the beautiful building we saw earlier, was also heavily destroyed in the Second World War, and then for years they would take the machines and everything and bring it over to Russia. Now finally, we are in the year 1958. More than a decade after all of this happened. And more than 12 minutes after I started talking. And a very curious lens hit the market, or rather the Soviet planned economy. It was the Helios 44, the 58mm F.2, the lens this video is all about. At the current edit, 12 minutes after the video started. Finally. And it was never admitted that it was from stolen plans from the Biota 58mm developed by MFT, but it's the only lens that is a 58mm besides the one from MFT, so it's not a far stretch. And I'm not an optical engineer, but these two designs are just the same. It was made in many factories in Russia, and it's kind of the Kalashnikov of the lens industry, but it creates beauty and not death. It's kind of impossible to fully distinguish this lens from its whole military and war-related history, but yeah, so we'll be aware of that, and it's a very interesting circle that is closing by taking this lens. Then again, back to Ukraine. So you might ask at this point, how is this lens? And it's beautiful. It's really one of my favorite lenses. When you use it on full frame, it gets this very iconic, swirly background, which is what it's most famous for, but it's actually not what I like to use it for the most. I've used it on full frame cameras too, but I prefer it actually as a kind of very tele lens on cropped factor cameras. It's soft, but it's also very usable. It's of the type of Russian design that is just very reliable and great. And I even modified it a little bit so that the aperture ring is actually smooth and doesn't do the clicking sound anymore, and that's pretty useful for videos. I used this lens for so many things. I used it in the Holocaust documentary, but I also used it for music videos, fictitious work, YouTube videos, everything. It's my tele lens. It's my favorite lens for that. I love it in the vintage flare and everything. It's just great. It makes the modern digital cameras with your 4K sensors and everything look very organic and so on. It's not the sharpest lens, but it can be if you stop it down. Actually, it's completely 4K ready. So Yep, I love it, and I'm not going to go to Ukraine without this lens. But let's actually talk about Ukraine and why this lens is involved. So I was very curious on where this lens was even produced, and actually you can see a certain symbol here, and there's symbols for all the different Russian factories. And this one is the KMZ factory, which was close to Moscow. So I was a little bit sad that it wasn't from the factory in Ukraine, near Kiev, where this was produced. That would have been really cool. But also, what an interesting thing to have it be produced in Russia and then take it to Ukraine again. So there's also the serial number, and there's a system for them. And I also found out that, well, my number is 9606160, and that actually means that it was made in 1996, so even after the fall of the Soviet Union. And somehow it ended up in a storage building in Ukraine, and then, well, we go to the war in Donbass. So, well, Russia attacked and they illegally occupied Crimea and started the war in Donbass that they would later, of course, expand to the full-scale invasion, which is taking place at the moment. And for this part, right now, this is the third or fourth recording I'm doing of this, because I want to be really precise with what I told and what is the story here. So they attacked, and after that, this lens flooded the market. A lot more of them got sold via eBay from Ukraine, and that begs a lot of questions, because how did this lens get to Ukraine? Why are there so many in Ukraine when they were produced in Russia? I couldn't find that out yet. And I got this lens with this, wait, where is it? I got the lens in this military type container here, and it was with some very military looking writings, which I threw away a few months ago, which I could really bite myself in the eye for that. But, well, and I was pretty sure it came from the military. So my theory long time was that they were actually sold to boost their military budget for the armament of Ukraine, for the increase in their army. But I read so many documents on military funding and how Ukraine expanded their military and everything, and I tried to find this out, tried to read up about the history. I spent a few nights researching this, and it was really frustrating because I just couldn't find answers to this. So the claim that I made previously, I also posted this on Instagram, that I bought this lens and thus financed the Ukrainian military in its expansion, which would have been super cool. Let's be frank about that. I retract that claim because I cannot substantiate it anymore. I couldn't find the seller on eBay anymore. I couldn't find the documents anymore. So I don't know. But I got it from Ukraine. I will take it back there. And actually I will there, if I can, find out more about the story of this lens. So please follow this channel if you want to hear about that. I'll be talking about that. Maybe there's a part 2 on this lens. There's definitely a part 2 because I'm gonna talk about this lens in Ukraine when I'm shooting there, definitely. So watch out for that. This is the video. It's a little bit anticlimactic. Well, I don't know, but it's a cool end. It's a cool circle we're closing, and it's a fascinating story that wasn't told before online about this lens. So I hope you had fun, and good night. I will finally finish this video now. I'm just so bad at making videos in a short while because I have just too high of a standard. I'm over editing them also, as you can see. They're way too over edited. So what can I do?